All right. Hello, and welcome to the Zone of Hot Truth, a podcast where we talk about our experiences, opinions, and hot takes as new DMs in supposedly 15 minutes. I'm Kevin.
I'm Eric, and I think water should be on the food pyramid.
I'm John, and water is the dumbest thing to go on a food pyramid. It doesn't possess any nutritional value.
I'm Grant, and I'm wondering if we're really going to make this a running joke.
Air, that's like saying air should be on the food pyramid.
Oh my
Hydration's
God.
important.
Yeah.
All right, so the podcast has already gone to shit.
This is fine. This is how it's meant to be. Oh, what is that subreddit? The Hydra Homies? That's Eric. Anyway, I'm sure Eric is sub to that shit. So the topic that we're going to be talking about today is leading from the previous discussion in the first episode where we were discussing kind of what we thought about the different ways that you can generate a character and what we used. So your characters, or your players, I should say, have generated their scores. What we're going to delve into, I think, is how we would want those players to turn those scores into characters, or whatever method they use there. So why don't we go ahead and start things off with Eric. So what do you think about this thing, which I expect something spicy. So yeah.
I think the first thing that players should do after they have the scores is ask the DM for a suggestion. To ask what would be an interesting character that the DM would like to see played.
I don't think that's spicy at all, actually.
Yeah, no, that's pretty.
Oh yeah.
No, that's amazing.
Some, like,
yeah.
Tomato cilantro shit.
That's mildly spicy to me.
Is it? Because I feel like this is a good talking off point. Yeah. Because I think like that's interesting because I think the best experience that you will probably get, this is my opinion for like a player, is the one that your DM is most excited about. Right. So you asking your DM like what kind of things he's interested in, which maybe it's a little less spicy than what Eric just said, but gives you an idea of like how to steer your character towards something that actually gets like the kind of screen time that you want versus the DM having to go, all right, let me make this revenge story real quick or something based upon the stats. So we've already veered a little bit off the stats, but
yeah, because I was just about to say, that could maybe be a tangent into talking about how much characters should bring to the table beforehand with their backstory.
I think it's in line.
I just don't care. I don't care too much about the stats. I think the first question should be, and I think I guess I could take it a step further and say I think players often come to the table after they've generated their scores with a pre-existing thought of this is the character I'm going to have, and it is often very boring given what the DM has planned. And the DM's putting in the most work by far. If we're going to go with that, I think the player responsibility is to say, okay, DM, what role do you see as being something that would get a lot of screen time or get a lot of attention?
Are there any lingering thoughts on that, John?
That's again, I don't disagree with that. That's again pretty mild.
Standard.
Having a conversation with your DM about what they would find interesting, what would be valuable, is the next logical step.
And I just like to, I guess, add a small caveat to mine. I said it was mildly spicy. In principle, I don't think there's anything wrong with the player and DM talking and the player trying to figure out what might be an interesting niche to fill. But at the end of as long as final say still rests with the player, because the DM could say, oh, this type of barbarian, but maybe the player wants to play like a rogue.
Mm-hmm. I don't think
the player can obviously go with whatever they want.
I don't think it's that specific. I think that what they're asking about is like not like what kind of classes you're interested in, but what kind of like concepts. So like, all right, so broadly, I'm interested in revenge plot because I'm just thinking about that or something like that, and I can imagine that being a thing. Anyway, I think just going down the line. So, John, what are your thoughts on kind of staring back to generating characters? Like they have their stats on the table. Like, well, what do you want them to do next?
In my opinion, what comes next is obviously there should be like a character concept. The character concept after you've talked with a DM. I guess like the next thing that I would want to see is how do we fit in with the group? And like, I guess my hot take is that all the characters should be initially linked. Not some of the characters. With my experience with it, like I did, every character must have one link to another. And what that ended up doing was feeling like there was two parties that were working together out of happenstance, as opposed to one party working together for a reason. When I mandated that everybody was linked, I started to get interesting banter back and forth. The party that I have with everybody being linked, I have a mother and a daughter, and their robot servant, and a cleric that stopped one day to help them. And like that expands off of that, and I think sets up initial like interesting dynamics, as opposed to two characters that are friends and two other characters that are acquaintances. Am I making sense?
No, I think that's perfectly clear, and I think that's a great way. I tried it, and I didn't have the same level of success, but I don't know if that's because I think the players were not as experienced, probably, as your players, in terms of fishing out those connections. Because a lot of them okay, we're war buddies, or something like that, and that's kind of hard to pull into the forefront while everything else is going on. Is what I found. Or like when questioned on it, they may not be something they want to discuss. And this is with a forced link. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yours was a forced link, and the characters just didn't develop on it in RP, or
yeah, there were. Go ahead.
No. I like or ...
Yeah. So I think that was the case with that, where I didn't see the link being something that I was really excited about it, and then it seemed to not generate the interest I was anticipating. is basically what happened.
So then I think there's probably a can of worms there about how to incentivize like drawing that out, like drawing in pre-set up storylines like that. But that's another conversation.
So Grant, what do you think? So characters, your players, I should say, have their stats generated. What would you like them to do as like their next steps for creating their character?
So, from my experience, and maybe this is just a different style of DMing, I don't always do the best job of reining in my players once I give them their stats. And from my experience, I've found players just start shooting in like different directions. And I just try my best to wrangle them back into some kind of common ground, like a shared focal point that I try to get them to discuss and figure out for why they're adventuring together. Kind of similar to what you and John just talked about with how many forced known interactions should exist before you actually start playing in the first session, which, or at least we all call it like session, basically the session zero talk, where you make the characters set the stage for the campaign in the world. And hopefully in that is when people actually discuss how they might know each other. Because I like to give my players a lot of freedom, which again can kind of, they just scatter in like 1,000 different directions for what they want to do with preconceived notions.
Oh yeah, which I think
can be a problem.
It's interesting. I think all of us, we don't have systems where we roll and have the character defined by the roll, right? So we can't really speak, I guess, too much to that. Like we give, I think all of us as DMs can tend to give our players quite a bit of freedom in what they create, within the scope of like what we want. For me, so I'm actually going to take this like a half step back, where I think looking at when you have the stats, like that should go into what kind of character you want to create. Like I think they should have an influence on the traits of the character, and that should be like one of the kind of starting points, like in addition to looking at the class and things. Like if you don't want your character to be, like have an 8 intelligence because you don't want to RP that, then you can shift the stat around, even if it's not, beneficial. There's actually a system that I really thought about as a great way for like a session zero thing, because I think a lot of characters don't come with like they don't know what they're going to RP. But Delta Green has one where if it's like the same stat levels as D&D, but if you are above average, then you have to come up with a 1-word descriptor associated with all of your 6 attributes. Or if you're below average, you have to come up with a 1-word descriptor for all your 6 attributes. So you end up with like, okay, here's what my character looks like. Like they tend to be like, they have a low charisma. That doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. It could be just shy. If they have a low intelligence, maybe they're just not learned. They are street smart. Like that, I like that as a system for helping define early on like what the concept is, because often you end up with like, I am, what is it, gnome wizard, and that's it.
Is that like a preset thing you're choosing from, or like that's bounded?
Mm-mm. It could be.
We can hear your head shaking.
Yeah, that's why I said Yeah, so it's not. So like in that system, it's there's a list of traits that you could have potentially, but I think it is not bounded. But
is there a mechanical impact to like choosing shy, or is it just a direction for your flavor?
I think it's just flavor. It gives the character a direction. But Eric, were you speaking? I don't know if you muted yourself. Yeah, there we go.
The interesting enough, until you mentioned it briefly, Kevin, none of us mentioned character classes as something that people should look at first after having their stats and turning them into characters. We should be that in all 4 of our takes, and this might be just our dynamic version of a hotter take, is the character class does not come second.
Story comes first.
Yeah, and that's actually really interesting. I think people tend to, as a player, look to what the class they get out of the stat. That they can, like, what they want to play, I guess, is what they're looking for, and then they try to shove that into the hole that is the story that is the DM wants to tell. So that's an interesting point, and I guess that kind of delves into, like, what kind of limitations do we set, like what is allowed based upon the stats are there, the characters are going to make characters.
Mine are pretty straightforward. No mystics because it's too long for me to read.
Yeah.
That's like basically like, and be WotC published. I don't want to have to deal with balancing homebrew.
Yeah.
And no monster races, because I like in most Forgotten Realm settings and most settings that I've dealt with, I don't know why if you're a bugbear walking into town, the town guard doesn't shoot you
on site.
You're a monster.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So, like, my restrictions are pretty loose. Like, it has to, because those are the big things that just don't make sense to me.
Yeah. And how?
Sorry, go.
No, go ahead.
I guess the problem with that, and maybe that's just because I've had more experienced players that I've been playing with, or more RP-focused players, I don't bound them into a specific box for, like, storylines or anything like that.
And I kind of try to do the same thing. Like, I don't like putting limits that are too strict on my players, because I've kind of only DM'd on the extremes, either for brand new players, like the whole group, or the whole group is very experienced. And I've actually seen that both groups, when I just kind of leave them to their own devices with a limited set of rules, like no monster races, that's a shared one I have with John, for example. After like a session or two, like they kind of just fall into some pretty interesting characters on their own, and I think part of that is because I just give them the freedom to do that.
As a quick thing, I will note that in my philosophy, I think the best creations are set by bounds and limitation. I think is kind of
I agree.
Not necessarily a hot take, but like if you like, I think that's like you restricting it to that, you help create like, here is the kind of story I'm trying to tell, and you end up with that. But I think you could go a step further and really steer that towards the kind of the what you want to see played in your game for a year or more. You know. Did you have any last thoughts on that, Eric?
How do you know what you want to be played? Like, it's like kind of devil's advocate. How do you find out this will be an interesting role after 2 years?
I prefer using, after reading a lot of systems, I prefer classless systems, such as I'll give a big shout out to Knave, which is all inventory based. That way, the focus is not on limiting, okay, you're going to have X number of spell slots, or you're going to be a X class. It's going to be more focused on what is your traits, what is your goal, and what is your relationship with the other characters.
And I think we'll leave that at that thought, and we'll give some last hot takes by our DMs. I don't even know what to say there. So why don't we just go around the horn, kind of give a last kind of hot take or just tip or something, whatever you want to say, and I think we're going to end it there. So why don't we start with, Eric, you had a last thought. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think what would also help a DM is not just one player going up to the DM and saying, what are you interested in? Having 2 players come up to the DM, I think is even better, of saying, hey, we want to have character concepts together. What can we do that is interesting together?
John?
I guess kind of a circle back on something that we were talking about. I do think that something that's super important is the idea of the starting of flavor and idea coming from the class itself. While you might have a story in mind first, easy character development and growth is seeing how the actual class itself grows and changes.
Grant?
And I think the great thing about D&D is its limitless potential in terms of like how much creativity how much you can explore your own creativity. And I like to encourage that. I like to see what crazy ideas players come up with. So I might try to steer them in like a certain direction, but at the end of the day, their crazy ideas are usually more interesting than anything I can come up with.
And for me, I think sometimes it's less. And the other thing I just want to kind of leave on is just the notion of like, we have stats that are there, use them to influence what your character is, like who they are, and especially early on, because people don't know what they're playing. Look at your stats. It'll tell you, here's what my character does. But anyway, I think that's going to be a last thing. Thank you for listening, and keep rolling those dice.